There's a moment in every man's life where he realizes the disguise has become more real than the face underneath it. Malcolm Turner lived in that moment. When we first see him in Big Mama's House 2, he's sitting at an FBI desk, shuffling paperwork, attending training seminars, living the life of a field agent who has finally hung up his undercover boots. He's married. His wife is pregnant. He promised her safety, stability, and a future where he comes home at night and stays there. He promised himself he was done with deception. But there's a photograph on his supervisor's desk, the body of his former partner, killed during an investigation. And suddenly, Malcolm understands a terrible truth. The only way to save his marriage is to destroy it with a lie. The only way to protect his family is to abandon them. And the only way to catch a killer is to become someone else so completely that the man he really is disappears entirely. This is not a story about a man who laughs his way through a case in a dress. This is a story about a man who discovers that the person wearing the suit might be more honest than the man taking it off. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. Malcolm Turner made a choice 3 years before this film begins. He walked away from undercover work, not because he was tired of it. Undercover operatives never really tire of the rush, the adrenaline, the feeling of being more alive in a false life than in a real one. He walked away because he fell in love with someone who deserved better than a husband who disappears into false identities and comes back to her changed in ways she can never quite understand. Sheila asked him for one thing: stability. She didn't ask him to stop being a federal agent. She asked him to be an agent who has boundaries, who has limits, who understands that the life he builds with her matters more than the life the Bureau demands of him. Malcolm said yes. He meant it. He got a desk job. He stopped taking field assignments. He attended his wife's doctor's appointments. He picked out baby clothes. He was becoming the kind of man he never thought he'd be. The kind of man who comes home at the end of the day and actually stays there. The film opens on this quiet life, this normal life, this almost perfect life. And in that normality, we feel the weight of what's about to be destroyed. Because Big Mama's House 2 understands something fundamental about men like Malcolm. They don't fail their families because they don't love them. They fail them because they love their work more. And they dress up that failure as duty. The call comes from his supervisor. A partner he worked with years ago, Kevin, has been killed during an investigation. Not in the line of duty, in a dramatic shootout. Killed while gathering intelligence on a man named Cheshire, a sophisticated criminal who has embedded himself in a wealthy family, living under an assumed name, preparing to sell a top-secret military technology to foreign operatives. The defense CD he's brokering could compromise every military installation in the country. Lives are at stake. National security is threatened. And the only way to get close enough to Cheshire to identify him and shut down the deal is to place an undercover agent inside his home. But Cheshire is paranoid and careful. He studies people. He notices inconsistencies. He would see through a fake housekeeper or a fake gardener in hours. There is only one disguise thorough enough to disarm him completely. One that transforms an agent so completely that suspicion never even forms. There is only one person who has ever successfully worn that disguise: Malcolm Turner. And there is only one person who can wear it now: Malcolm Turner. His supervisor doesn't ask. The Bureau doesn't negotiate. They tell him, your country needs you. Your partner is dead, and you're the only one who can do this. In that moment, Malcolm faces a choice that the film never quite acknowledges, but that haunts every scene that follows. He can tell the truth to Sheila. He can tell her about Kevin, about the assignment, about the fact that he's the only one capable of doing this job. Or he can lie. He chooses to lie. That choice, made in a supervisor's office, made without fanfare or dramatic music, made because Malcolm cannot look his wife in the eye and tell her that duty matters more than his promise to her. That choice is the hinge on which everything that follows turns. Malcolm tells Sheila he has to attend an FBI training conference. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Nothing dangerous, just bureaucratic requirements for agents who want to stay current. She doesn't want him to go. She's 7 months pregnant and she needs him, and he's leaving her anyway. But he tells her it's mandatory, and she believes him because she's never had a reason not to believe him. He packs a bag. He drives to a sprawling mansion in the suburbs where the Cheshire family lives. And then he does something that millions of viewers have laughed at without quite understanding why it's tragic. He puts on the Big Mama suit. The rubber face goes on. The wig goes on. The bodysuit compresses his frame into a shape that isn't quite human. He looks in the mirror and sees a character, a loud, outrageous, impossible to ignore figure. What he doesn't see anymore is himself. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this film. Every time he puts on this suit, Malcolm becomes more convincing as Big Mama and less convincing as Malcolm. Every time he stays in character, he moves further away from the man his wife is waiting for. Every lie he tells the Cheshire family about who he is and why he's there is another lie he's building between himself and Sheila. The film frames this as comedy, but comedy is often just tragedy wearing a mask, and Malcolm Turner is becoming an expert at both. The Cheshire household is, on the surface, a picture of American suburban success. Fuller Cheshire runs a technology company from a home office, drives an expensive car, attends his children's school events, and presents himself to the neighborhood as a devoted father and a pillar of the community. His wife Leah is warm, composed, and completely unaware of who her husband actually is. Their 3 children, Molly, Carrie, and little Andrew, are navigating the specific chaos of adolescence and childhood in a home where the father is physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Molly is 17 and already pushing against every boundary her parents try to set, sneaking out at night, lying about her whereabouts, performing the perfectly teenage ritual of becoming someone her parents don't recognize. Carrie is quieter, more watchful, carrying the anxiety of a child who senses that something in her home is wrong but cannot name it. And Andrew is 6 years old and simply wants someone to pay attention to him. This family is not a criminal enterprise. They are collateral. They are the people who will be destroyed when the truth about Fuller Cheshire finally surfaces. And they are the people who, completely without intending to, are about to have their lives changed by a 200-pound undercover FBI agent in a rubber suit. The film understands this complexity more than it gets credit for. The Cheshire family is not a backdrop. They are the reason this story matters. Big Momma arrives at the Cheshire household with a fabricated employment history, a personality large enough to fill every room she walks into, and an agenda that has nothing to do with childcare. But something unexpected happens within the first 48 hours that no mission briefing could have prepared Malcolm for. The children respond to Big Momma, not in the polite, arm's-length way that children respond to staff members in wealthy households. They respond to her the way children respond to someone who actually sees them. Molly, who has been waging a cold war against every adult in her life, lets her guard down around Big Momma in ways she hasn't with her own parents in years. Carrie, who has been carrying her anxiety in silence, starts to talk. Andrew, who has been largely invisible in a household where everyone is too busy with their own crises, starts to laugh. And this is where Big Momma's house too begins to do something genuinely interesting beneath its broad comedy surface. Malcolm Turner, who came into this house to gather intelligence on a criminal, finds himself becoming something the children in this house actually need. He is more present as Big Momma than Fuller Cheshire has been as a father. He is more attentive as a disguise than most adults are as themselves. And that irony is not lost on him, because back home, his own wife is 7 months pregnant and waiting for a husband who told her he was at a training conference. The comedy of Big Momma's house too operates on 2 levels simultaneously, and understanding both is essential to understanding why the film works in ways its critics refuse to acknowledge. On the surface level, the comedy is broad, physical, and deliberately absurd. Big Momma is a character designed for maximum comedic impact. Enormous, loud, opinionated, physically impossible to ignore. Martin Lawrence plays her with complete commitment, never winking at the audience, never breaking character to signal that he knows this is ridiculous. That commitment is what makes the physical comedy land. When Big Momma joins a cheerleading squad, when she navigates a spa day, when she accidentally causes chaos in every room she enters, the comedy works because Lawrence is playing it completely straight. He is not doing an impression of a woman. He is playing a specific character who happens to be physically implausible. But beneath that surface comedy is a second layer that operates on a completely different emotional register. Big Momma is a better caregiver than anyone in this household. She is more honest with the children about who they are and what they need than their own parents have been. And she is more emotionally present inside this disguise than Malcolm Turner has managed to be as himself for the past several months. The film never stops to make this point explicitly. It doesn't need to. It simply shows us Big Momma with the children and then cuts to Malcolm on the phone with Sheila, lying again about where he is. The juxtaposition is the point. What the film is building toward, slowly and beneath its comedy scaffolding, is a question about authenticity. Which version of a person is the real one? The version they perform for the people who love them, or the version they become when they have nothing left to hide behind? Malcolm Turner, inside the Big Momma suit, has nothing to hide behind. His real name, his real job, his real life, all of it is invisible, and paradoxically, stripped of everything that defines him in his real life. He becomes more genuinely present than he has been in years. He listens to Molly the way a father listens to a daughter he's terrified of losing. He comforts Carrie the way a parent comforts a child who is frightened of things she can't name. He plays with Andrew the way a man plays with a child when he has no agenda and no schedule and nowhere else to be. This is the emotional sleight of hand at the center of Big Mama's house too. The disguise doesn't hide Malcolm Turner. It reveals him. And what it reveals is a man who is capable of far more warmth, more patience, more genuine human connection than he allows himself to express when he's being Malcolm Turner, FBI agent, husband, expectant father, man with a reputation and a career and a promise to keep. The suit is not a mask. It is, in the most unexpected way possible, a mirror. The first full day inside the Cheshire household teaches Malcolm Turner something that no amount of bureau training could have prepared him for. Surveillance work, when you are embedded inside a family rather than watching from a distance, is not a passive exercise. It is a performance that never stops. There is no moment where you can step out of character, no window where you can drop the accent or the mannerisms or the enormous physical presence of Big Mama and simply breathe as yourself. Every meal is a performance. Every conversation with the children is an opportunity to gather information and simultaneously an opportunity to blow your cover. Every interaction with Fuller Cheshire himself, the man Malcolm is there to investigate, is a tightrope walk between being convincing enough to stay in the house and being so convincing that Cheshire starts to trust Big Mama in ways that make him careless around her. Malcolm has done undercover work before. He knows the fundamentals. You build a persona, you maintain it, you gather what you need, and you get out. But he has never done it like this. He has never had to be everything to a family at once. Nanny, confidant, cook, disciplinarian, comic relief. While simultaneously running a covert intelligence operation out of a bedroom, he's converted into a makeshift surveillance post. The physical and psychological demands of what Malcolm is doing are extraordinary, and the film, to its credit, never lets you forget it. Every slapstick sequence, every moment where Big Mama's physical implausibility causes chaos in a domestic setting, is also a moment where Malcolm is one wrong move away from the entire operation collapsing. The comedy and the tension are the same thing. That is not an accident. Fuller Cheshire, meanwhile, is a study in the specific kind of danger that hides behind normalcy. He is not a cartoon villain. He does not sneer at his family or conduct suspicious phone calls in plain view or behave in ways that would signal to even a casual observer that something is wrong. He is charming, measured, and entirely in control of the image he projects. He coaches Andrew's little league team. He remembers Carrie's school recital. He asks Leah about her day and listens to her answers with the patient attention of a man who has spent years perfecting the art of seeming trustworthy. What makes Cheshire genuinely unnerving is not what he does in plain sight. It is what he does when he thinks no one is watching. And this is where Big Mama's surveillance operation begins to yield results. Malcolm, moving through the household in a disguise that makes him effectively invisible to Cheshire's paranoia, starts to notice the small fractures in the performance. The office door that is always locked. The phone calls taken outside the house. The way Cheshire's eyes track exits whenever a stranger enters a room. These are not the habits of a nervous businessman. They are the habits of a man who has spent years maintaining a double life and has become so accustomed to vigilance that he cannot turn it off even in his own home. Malcolm recognizes these patterns because he has lived them himself, and that recognition, that uncomfortable mirroring between hunter and target, gives Big Mama's house one of its most quietly compelling undercurrents. Malcolm is surveilling a man who is doing, in a different register, exactly what Malcolm is doing. They are both performing identities that are not their own. They are both lying to the same family. The difference is the direction of the damage they are willing to cause. Molly Cheshire is the character the film invests most deeply in after Malcolm himself, and understanding her arc is essential to understanding what Big Mama's house 2 is actually about beneath its comedy surface. She is 17, furious, and performing the specific kind of adolescent rebellion that is less about freedom and more about being seen. She sneaks out not because she particularly wants to go where she's going, but because the act of defiance is the only language she has found that her parents respond to. She lies not because she is dishonest by nature, but because honesty with her parents has never produced the response she needed from them. Her father is emotionally absent in the specific way that men consumed by secret lies are always emotionally absent, physically present, performatively attentive, but fundamentally unreachable. Her mother, Leah, is warm and loving, but so focused on managing the family's surface presentation that she has missed the depth of Molly's unhappiness. Into this dynamic walks Big Mama, who does something radical. She pays attention, not the managed, performative attention that both of Molly's parents have perfected. Genuine attention, the kind that notices what a person is actually saying beneath what they are claiming to say. When Big Mama confronts Molly about sneaking out, she does not lecture her. She listens first. And for Molly, that is so unfamiliar that it disarms her completely. The film handles this relationship with more nuance than any critic has given it credit for. Big Mama does not fix Molly. She does not deliver a speech that resolves 17 years of emotion emotional neglect. She simply treats her like someone whose interior life matters. And that, the film suggests, is the thing Molly has been waiting for so long that she had stopped believing she would ever find it. The investigation takes its first serious step forward when Malcolm discovers that Cheshire has been using the family's home network to communicate with his overseas buyers. The defense CD, the classified military technology that got Kevin killed, is closer than Malcolm initially estimated. Cheshire is not in the early stages of the deal. He is in the final stages. The handoff is weeks away, possibly days. This revelation raises the operational stakes in a way that forces Malcolm to make another choice that the film handles with quiet precision. He can contact his supervisor and request extraction, a move that would end the mission, potentially spook Cheshire, and leave the case without a conviction. Or he can push deeper into the operation, gathering enough evidence to guarantee an airtight prosecution while maintaining his cover in a household that is beginning to depend on him in ways that make extraction feel like abandonment. Malcolm calls his supervisor from the bathroom at 2 in the morning, the Big Mama wig sitting on the sink beside him. And what the film gives us in that scene is a man who is no longer certain which obligation should win. The Bureau wants the case closed. The children want Big Mama at breakfast. Sheila wants her husband home. And Malcolm Turner, sitting on a bathroom floor in a stranger's house at 2 in the morning, cannot figure out which version of himself he owes the most to. What the film does with Leah Cheshire is more interesting than it initially appears, and it is worth pausing on her character because she represents something the script of Big Mama's House 2 is genuinely attempting that most comedies of this era never tried. Leah is not a fool. She is not an oblivious wife who has simply failed to notice that her husband is a criminal. She is a woman who has built her entire identity around the stability of her marriage and her family, and who has unconsciously trained herself not to ask the questions whose answers would destroy that stability. There is a psychological term for this: motivated blindness. It is the cognitive mechanism by which intelligent people fail to see things that are directly in front of them because seeing them would require a level of disruption they are not prepared to face. Leah sees the locked office door. She notices the private phone calls. She registers the moments when her husband flinches at unexpected sounds or watches strangers too carefully. She notices all of it, and she has chosen, for years, not to follow any of those observations to their logical conclusion. Big Mama's presence in the household begins to disturb that equilibrium, not because Big Mama confronts Leah with the truth, but because Big Mama's genuine warmth and attention create a contrast that makes Leah aware of how little of either she has been receiving from her husband. You cannot show someone what genuine care looks like without also showing them what the absence of it looks like. And Leah, for the first time in years, is beginning to feel the shape of that absence. The cheerleading sequence that lands at roughly the midpoint of Big Mama's involvement with the Cheshire family is the film's most discussed set piece, and it is worth examining what it is actually doing beyond its obvious function as a vehicle for physical comedy. Molly has joined her school's cheerleading squad, partly out of genuine interest and partly because she knows her parents won't come to the competitions. Big Mama volunteers to help coach the squad, an offer that is so outlandishly implausible that the other parents accept it immediately because no one who looked like that could possibly be a threat to anyone. What follows is a sequence built on the comedy of physical impossibility, an enormous woman performing cheerleading routines with complete sincerity and surprising effectiveness. Martin Lawrence commits to every moment of it with the kind of physical fearlessness that reminds you he is a genuinely gifted comedian operating at the peak of his abilities. But beneath the comedy, the sequence is doing something precise and purposeful. For the first time in years, Molly has an adult in her corner who shows up, not metaphorically, literally shows up, stands on the field, embarrasses herself in front of everyone, and does it all without any agenda except being there for her. Molly's response to this, the slow, reluctant, deeply moving realization that she is not invisible to this person, is the emotional core of the entire film. And it happens inside a cheerleading routine. That is the quiet genius of what Big Mama's House 2 is doing when it is working at its best. Malcolm's cover comes under its first serious threat when a bureau colleague named Mark, who has been running parallel surveillance on Cheshire from the outside, makes contact in a way that nearly exposes the operation. Mark doesn't know the depth of Malcolm's cover. He doesn't understand that Malcolm has embedded himself so completely that any visible contact between them risks destroying everything. Their encounter, brief, accidental, and almost catastrophic, forces Malcolm to make a series of rapid improvisations that are simultaneously the film's funniest scene and its most tense. Because this is the moment where the two levels of the film, the comedy and the thriller, are operating at exactly the same pitch at exactly the same time. Malcolm has to maintain the Big Mama persona convincingly enough to prevent Cheshire from registering registering anything unusual, while simultaneously communicating to Mark that he needs to back off immediately. He does this in plain view of the entire Cheshire family, without breaking character for a single second. It is a masterclass in performance under pressure, and the pressure is real. If Cheshire recognizes that something is wrong in this moment, the mission ends, the case collapses, and Kevin died for nothing. Malcolm pulls it off, but the cost is another layer of complexity added to an operation that is already pushing the limits of what one man can sustain. By the end of Act 2, Malcolm Turner is no longer simply an FBI agent running an undercover operation. He is something more complicated and more dangerous than that. He is a man who has begun to care about the outcome of this family's story in a way that has nothing to do with the case. He wants Molly to stop running from the people who love her. He wants Carrie to stop being afraid of things she cannot name. He wants Andrew to have a father who sees him. He wants Leah to stop choosing not to ask the questions she already knows the answers to. And he wants Fuller Cheshire to face what he has done, not just to national security, but to the people sitting across from him at breakfast every morning. The mission and the human story have become the same thing. And Malcolm Turner, deep inside a disguise that was supposed to keep him at a distance from all of it, has never been more personally invested in his entire career. The moment Sheila Turner arrives at the Cheshire household is the moment the film shifts from a comedy about deception into something that feels genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. She doesn't arrive because she has discovered the truth. She arrives because she is 7 months pregnant, because her husband has been away for weeks on what she believes is a training conference, and because she has reached the point where the loneliness of carrying his child alone in their house has become unbearable. She tracks him down through the bureau, not Malcolm's supervisor, who would have warned him, but a junior administrator who simply tells her which city her husband is working in. She flies there. She shows up, and what she finds is not her husband at a training conference. What she finds is Big Momma, standing in the kitchen of a stranger's house, wearing a rubber suit and feeding breakfast to 3 children who are not hers. The look on Sheila's face in this moment is one of the film's great unacknowledged achievements. She is not angry yet. She is confused in the specific way that people are confused when reality presents them with something so far outside their frame of reference that their brain cannot immediately process what they are seeing. She knows that is her husband's voice. She knows those are her husband's eyes. And she is standing in a kitchen in suburban California watching him serve pancakes to children in a fat suit. The comedy of the situation is real, but so is the betrayal underneath it. What makes the Sheila confrontation so layered is that Malcolm cannot break cover to explain himself. Not immediately. Not with the Cheshire children present. Not with Fuller Cheshire himself potentially within earshot. Not with weeks of operational work balanced on the razor's edge of this single moment. He has to keep Sheila in character. Has to somehow convince her to play along with something she has not been briefed on, does not understand, and has every reason to be furious about, without being able to speak to her as her husband. He does this in a way that is both genuinely funny and quietly devastating. He pulls her aside, maintains the Big Momma voice and mannerisms while whispering the essentials through clenched teeth, and asks her to trust him in a situation where he has given her almost no reason to. And Sheila, because she is a woman who has spent years married to an FBI agent and has learned to read the specific tension in his body when the job has taken over, makes a decision. She stays. She plays along. She smiles at the Cheshire family and pretends to be a visiting relative of Big Momma's. And in that decision, that act of grace extended to a man who does not entirely deserve it in this moment, we see everything that is real and unbreakable in Malcolm and Sheila's marriage. She is furious. She will make him answer for this. But she understands, at some level that goes beyond language, that he is here because someone died and because he believed he was the only one who could do something about it. She has always known who she married. She just didn't think she'd have to keep learning it like this. The pressure on the operation intensifies when Malcolm intercepts a communication that confirms Cheshire's timeline. The handoff of the defense CD is not weeks away. It is 72 hours away. Cheshire has arranged a meeting with his overseas contact, a meeting that will happen off-site, away from the family home, in a location that Malcolm cannot surveil from inside the house. This changes the entire operational calculus. Everything Malcolm has gathered so far, the communications intercepts, the financial trail, the pattern of behavior, is circumstantial without a direct observation of the handoff itself. The Bureau needs Malcolm present at the exchange to provide eyewitness testimony and to coordinate the arrest. But being present at the exchange means leaving the Cheshire household. And leaving the Cheshire household means breaking cover in a way that cannot be undone. Big Momma cannot simply disappear for 72 hours and reappear without explanation. The children will notice. Leah will notice. And if Cheshire notices, he will spook and the entire operation collapses with hours to spare. Malcolm is caught between the demand demands of the case and the architecture of the cover he has built, and for the first time in the operation, there is no clean solution. Every option costs something. The question is what he is willing to pay. It is Sheila who provides the solution, and the film gives her this moment deliberately. She has been inside the Cheshire house for 24 hours now, playing the role of Big Mama's visiting relative, watching her husband navigate an undercover operation of extraordinary complexity while simultaneously managing 3 children, a suspicious criminal, and a marriage that is hanging on by the thread of her goodwill. She has had time to observe. She has had time to think. And what she proposes is operationally sound, personally risky, and reveals something about her character that the film has been building toward without making explicit. She will stay in the house as the visible presence while Malcolm extracts himself to cover the handoff. She will maintain the fiction of Big Mama's continued presence through a combination of careful misdirection and her own considerable intelligence. She is not trained for undercover work. She is 7 months pregnant, and she is the best option Malcolm has. What the film is doing here is something that most action comedies of this era never managed. It is giving the female lead genuine agency in the resolution of the plot. Sheila is not a passive recipient of her husband's heroism. She is a co-architect of the solution. She is taking a real risk for a mission she was not consulted about and did not agree to. And she is doing it not because the script requires her to, but because she has decided that her husband's obligation to Kevin's memory is also, in some way, her obligation. That is what marriage looks like when it is real. There is a scene in the middle of Act 3 that almost no reviewer has ever discussed, and it is the scene that most clearly reveals what Big Mama's House 2 is genuinely about when it stops pretending to be a simple comedy. Malcolm, in the hours before the handoff operation, sits with Carrie in the garden, not as Big Mama performing warmth for an audience, not as an agent gathering intelligence, just as a person sitting with a child who is frightened of something she cannot name. Carrie has been the quietest of the 3 Cheshire children throughout the film, the one who watches rather than acts, who absorbs rather than expresses, who carries her anxiety so carefully that most adults have simply stopped noticing it is there. Malcolm has noticed. Big Mama has noticed. And in this scene, sitting in a garden while the sun goes down and the clock on the operation counts forward toward its conclusion, the film allows something genuinely tender to happen. Malcolm does not fix Carrie's anxiety. He does not deliver a speech about courage or resilience or the importance of talking to your parents. He sits with her in her fear. He tells her, in Big Mama's voice with Malcolm Turner's sincerity, that being afraid of things you cannot name is not weakness. It is the beginning of understanding them. It is one of the most quietly powerful moments in the film, and it is powerful precisely because it is delivered by a man in a rubber suit. In the garden of a house he entered under false pretenses 24 hours before an operation that could go wrong in a dozen different ways. The context makes it absurd. The feeling makes it true. The operational machinery of Act 3 is tighter and more propulsive than anything in the first 2 acts, and the film uses that acceleration deliberately. As Cheshire moves toward the handoff, the comedy begins to recede, and the thriller architecture that has been running quietly beneath the surface of the entire film starts to become visible. Malcolm coordinates with his bureau contact. Extraction routes are established. The arrest team is positioned. Everything is moving with the mechanical precision of a well-planned operation, which means, in the logic of movies and in the logic of real undercover work, that something is about to go wrong. What goes wrong is Molly. In a moment of teenage impulsiveness that is completely consistent with everything the film has shown us about her character, she follows her father. She doesn't know what she is following him to. She doesn't know what her father actually is or what the meeting she is walking into actually represents. She follows him because she has spent 17 years trying to understand who her father really is beneath the performance, and tonight something in his behavior, the tension, the controlled urgency, the way he moved through the house like a man with a destination he didn't want anyone to know about, triggered the instinct that has been driving her rebellion all along. She wants the truth about her father. She is about to get it in a way she never anticipated. The discovery that Molly has followed Cheshire to the handoff location transforms the final sequence from a clean bureau operation into something far more personal and far more dangerous. Malcolm's arrest plan cannot proceed as designed with a civilian teenager at the scene, a teenager who does not know she is a civilian at a crime scene, who does not know her father is a criminal, who does not know that the men meeting him are dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with a business deal gone wrong. The bureau team has to hold. Malcolm has to improvise. And what he improvises is the film's most emotionally complex scene, because it requires him to simultaneously manage Molly's safety, maintain enough of a bureau presence to prevent Cheshire from completing the handoff, and do all of it without the Big Mama disguise that has been his primary operational tool for weeks. For the first time in the film, Malcolm Turner has to be Malcolm Turner. Turner. No suit, no character, no layers of performance between himself and the situation. Just a federal agent and a frightened teenager and a criminal who is about to realize that his cover has been completely destroyed. The scene works on every level it is asked to work on. As action, it is tense and efficiently staged. As character, it is the moment the film has been building toward from its first frame. Malcolm, stripped of every disguise, is finally just himself. And it turns out that is exactly enough. What Molly witnesses in those final minutes before the arrest changes her in a way that the film handles with admirable restraint. She does not immediately understand everything she has seen. She does not have a clean epiphany that resolves her relationship with her father or her anger at the adults in her life or the years of feeling invisible in her own home. What she has is evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence that the world is more complicated than she understood, that people are capable of living lives their families know nothing about, and that the adults around her have been carrying secrets whose weight she never even registered. She also has evidence of something else, something that matters more to her than the criminal case against her father. She has evidence that someone showed up for her, not her parents, not any adult who was supposed to care about her. An enormous, implausible, deeply strange woman who turned out to be an FBI agent in a rubber suit. Big Mama showed up. Malcolm Turner showed up. And in the wreckage of everything Molly thought she knew about her family, that fact, that specific, particular fact, is the thing she will carry forward. Someone saw her. Someone came. That is the emotional resolution of Big Mama's house too. Not the arrest, not the recovered defense CD, not the national security threat neutralized. The resolution is a 17-year-old girl discovering that she was worth showing up for all along. The arrest of Fuller Cheshire is not the climax of Big Mama's house too. That is the first thing to understand about, because most viewers and virtually every critic who has written about this film have made the mistake of treating the bureau operation as the story's central engine when it is actually the story's backdrop. The arrest happens. It is efficient and well staged and delivers the procedural satisfaction that the thriller architecture of the film has been promising since Kevin's death was announced in the opening act. Cheshire is taken into custody. The defense CD is recovered. The overseas buyers are identified and flagged to the appropriate agencies. The national security threat is neutralized. All of this happens exactly as it should, with the clean resolution of a case that has been building for weeks. But the camera does not linger on the handcuffs going on Cheshire's wrists. It does not linger on Malcolm's supervisor congratulating him on a successful operation. It lingers on Molly, standing at the edge of the scene, watching the father she followed into the night being walked toward a federal vehicle, processing a truth about her family that she spent 17 years being protected from. And that protection, it turns out, was its own kind of damage. The film knows where its real story is, and its real story has nothing to do with classified military technology. What happens to Leah Cheshire in the aftermath of her husband's arrest is handled with a sensitivity that the film rarely receives credit for, partly because it is embedded inside a comedy and partly because it unfolds quickly in the final act. Leah's world has just been destroyed. Everything she built her identity around, her marriage, her family's stability, her belief in the man she chose, has been revealed as a construction. Her husband is not a businessman. He is a criminal. The house they live in, the life they have built, the security she worked so hard to project to the outside world, all of it was financed at least in part by something she did not know about and did not choose. She is not a victim in a simple sense. She is something more complicated, a person who protected herself from the truth for so long that the truth's arrival feels like violence. Big Mama's House 2 does not give Leah a breakdown scene or a dramatic confrontation. It gives her something quieter and more honest, a moment where she sits in her kitchen, in her perfect suburban house, and simply stops performing. The mask that has been as much hers as her husband's comes off, and what is underneath it is a woman who is going to have to figure out who she is when the story she told about herself is no longer available to tell. The film trusts the audience to understand the weight of that without spelling it out. That is a significant piece of directorial restraint in a film not generally praised for restraint. Malcolm Turner, for the first time since putting on the Big Mama suit, has to have an honest conversation with his wife, not as an agent debriefing an operation, not as a husband managing damage. An honest conversation, the kind where you sit across from someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and you say the things you have been avoiding saying, because saying them out loud makes them real in a way that thinking them does not. Malcolm tells Sheila everything, not just the details of the operation. She already knows most of those. He tells her about Kevin. He tells her about the guilt that has been driving him since Kevin's death, the sense that he could have prevented it, that if he had been sharper or faster or more present in the weeks before the operation, Kevin might still be alive. He tells her that the real reason he lied about where he was going was not operational security. It was shame. He did not want her to know that he was still capable of choosing choosing the job over her. He did not want her to see that the man who promised her a quiet life still had that other life living inside him, still answered when it called, still believed at some level that the work was the thing that made him real. What the film does with this confession is remarkable in the context of its genre. Malcolm does not get immediate absolution. Sheila does not immediately forgive him. She listens. She sits with what he has said. And then she tells him something that becomes, quietly, the thematic statement of the entire film. She did not need him to stop being who he is. She needed him to stop pretending he was someone else. The children's farewells to Big Momma are the scenes that have stayed with audiences longer than any other element of Big Momma's house too, and they deserve more analytical attention than they typically receive. Molly, Carrie, and Andrew have to say goodbye to a person who is not real, a character that was constructed to gain access to their home and their father's secrets. They know this now. Molly knows. She was there. She saw Malcolm without the suit. She understands what Big Momma actually was and why Big Momma was in their house. And yet the grief she feels at this farewell is completely real, because what Big Momma gave her was real, regardless of the fiction that delivered it. The attention was real. The showing up was real. The moment on the cheerleading field was real. The conversations were real. A disguise can deliver genuine care. A false identity can contain true feeling. And a man who came into your life under false pretenses can still be the person who changed it. This is the paradox that Big Momma's House 2 has been building toward, and the farewell scenes are where it finally makes it fully explicit. Molly does not hug Big Momma goodbye because she has forgiven the deception. She hugs Big Momma goodbye because the deception contains something she needed more than the truth. That is not a simple moral position for a studio comedy to take. That is a genuinely complicated idea about the nature of authenticity, connection, and what we owe each other when the circumstances of care are imperfect. The film earns it. The question that Big Momma's House 2 poses at this stage of its story, and that it never quite answers directly, which is one of its strengths, is whether Malcolm Turner has actually changed. He has said the right things to Sheila. He has acknowledged the guilt about Kevin, the compulsion toward the work, the pattern of choosing the job, and then lying about it to protect the people he loves from knowing that he chose it. He has said all of that, but saying something and changing because of it are not the same thing. The film is smart enough to understand this distinction and to leave the question partially open. Malcolm goes home with Sheila. He is there for the birth of their child. He holds his son, a boy, as it turns out, and in that moment the film gives Martin Lawrence one of his finest purely non-comic scenes. The look on Malcolm's face in this moment is not the look of a man completing a character arc. It is the look of a man who understands, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, what he has been risking every time he chose the work over the life. The baby is not a symbol. The baby is the consequence of every choice Malcolm has made, and every choice he will make from this point forward. The film does not promise us that he will make better ones. It shows us a man who now understands what is at stake when he doesn't. That is not a resolution. It is a beginning, and the film is honest enough to treat it as one rather than pretending it is something more complete. Martin Lawrence's performance across Big Momma's House 2 deserves a more serious critical reassessment than it has ever received, and Act 4 is where the full range of what he has been doing becomes most visible. The broad physical comedy of the Big Momma character, the pratfalls, the voice, the sheer physical impossibility of a 200-pound man performing suburban domestic tasks in a rubber suit, has tended to dominate the critical conversation about his work in this film, which is understandable because that comedy is genuinely excellent. Lawrence is a master of physical performance, and Big Momma is one of the most technically demanding characters he has ever played. But what Act 4 reveals is that he has been running a parallel emotional performance the entire time, one that operates beneath the comedy and surfaces fully only when the suit comes off. The scene where Malcolm confesses to Sheila is not a scene that any amount of comic skill could carry. It requires a different kind of performance, quieter, more exposed, more willing to sit inside discomfort without deflecting it with a joke. Lawrence delivers it without a single false note. The transition from the exaggerated expressiveness of Big Momma to the stripped-down honesty of Malcolm in this scene is the performance of a genuinely skilled actor who has been underestimated by critics who could not see past the rubber suit. There is real craft in this film. It is simply wearing a disguise. The film's treatment of Fuller Cheshire's children in the aftermath of his arrest is one of the areas where Big Momma's House 2 most clearly exceeds the expectations of its genre. It would have been entirely acceptable, within the conventions of the action comedy, to simply let the Cheshire family recede into the background once the operational objective is achieved. The case is closed. The criminal is arrested. The hero goes home. That is the formula, and the formula does not require any further investment in the collateral lives affected by the operation. But the film does not do this. It returns to Molly and Carrie and Andrew one more time, not to resolve their stories. Their stories are not resolvable in the space of a film's final act, but to acknowledge that they exist beyond the operational frame Malcolm placed around them. They are not props in his mission. They are people whose lives have been permanently altered by what happened in their house over the past several weeks, and the film insists on recognizing that even as it moves toward its conclusion. This insistence is not dramatic or heavy-handed. It is simply a choice to treat these characters as human beings rather than as furniture. In a film that was dismissed by most critics as a lazy cash grab sequel, that choice represents something genuine. It represents a filmmaker and a cast who cared about the story they were telling even when the studio and the critics had already decided they didn't need to. Andrew Cheshire, 6 years old, largely overlooked throughout the operational phase of the film, the child who simply wanted someone to pay attention to him, gets the film's final genuinely funny moment and also, unexpectedly, its final genuinely moving one. He has been told that Big Momma has to go. He does not fully understand what happened. He does not understand why the woman who played with him and laughed with him and made him feel like the most important person in the room is leaving and not coming back in the same way. What he understands is absence, the specific quality of an absence after presence. And in his response to that, a 6-year-old's unfiltered, unembarrassed grief at losing someone who made him feel seen. The film finds its most honest emotional statement. We spend so much of our lives performing for people who are not really watching us. We spend so much energy maintaining the versions of ourselves that we think the world requires. And every now and then, if we are lucky, someone comes along who sees through all of it, who sees the actual person underneath the performance, and pays attention to that person instead. It does not matter that this particular someone was wearing a rubber suit. It does not matter that the circumstances of the attention were built on a fiction. Andrew Cheshire was seen. And for a 6-year-old boy who had been invisible in his own home, that is everything. Big Momma's House 2 exists within a specific tradition of American comedy that critics have consistently undervalued, the disguise film. From Some Like It Hot to Tootsie to Mrs. Doubtfire, the disguise film operates on a precise structural logic that the best examples of the genre use to explore questions about identity, authenticity, and the gap between who we are and who we perform for the people around us. What unites these films is not the comedy of the disguise itself, though that comedy is always present and always essential, but the emotional and psychological transformation that the disguise enables. The character who puts on the disguise discovers something about themselves that they could not have accessed any other way. They discover it precisely because the disguise removes the social constraints, the professional obligations, the relational expectations, and the self-constructed narratives that normally prevent people from being fully present with the people around them. Big Momma's House 2 belongs in this tradition. It is not as formally accomplished as Tootsie or as emotionally devastating as Mrs. Doubtfire, but it is doing the same thing those films do, with the same structural logic, and with more genuine feeling than its critical reception has ever acknowledged. Malcolm Turner puts on the Big Momma suit to solve a case. What he discovers inside it is himself. That is not a trivial thing to discover in a studio comedy sequel. That is the thing those films are always actually about. The comparison to Mrs. Doubtfire is worth pursuing in some detail because it illuminates what Big Momma's House 2 is doing at its most ambitious and where it falls short of its potential. In Mrs. Doubtfire, the Daniel Hillard character puts on his disguise specifically to remain present in his children's lives after a divorce removes him from the family home. The disguise is, from the beginning, an act of love, complicated, problematic, legally indefensible love, but love nonetheless. And what Robin Williams finds inside that disguise is a version of himself that is more patient, more attentive, more genuinely nurturing than the version his children knew before. The genius of that film is that it never lets Daniel off the hook for the deception, even while affirming the love that motivated it. He causes real harm to real people in the name of something real and good. Big Momma's House 2 is working with the same paradox, but with an important difference. Malcolm's disguise is not originally an act of love. It is an act of professional obligation, of guilt, of the specific compulsion that drives certain men to define themselves through what they do rather than who they are to the people who love them. The love comes later. It comes when the children respond to him in ways he did not anticipate and could not have manufactured. And that distinction, love as consequence rather than motivation, is what makes Malcolm's arc in this film more morally complicated than it first appears. The film's relationship with its own genre is one of its most interesting and least discussed qualities. Big Momma's House 2 is marketed and received as a broad studio comedy sequel, which it is. But it is also, operating simultaneously and without announcement, a domestic thriller, a character study about masculine identity, and an unexpectedly earnest examination of what it means to be present for the people who need you. Director John Whitesell does not call attention to the these additional registers. He does not signal to the audience that the film they are watching is more than what it appears to be. He trusts the material to do its work beneath the comedy without requiring the viewer to acknowledge it explicitly. This is both the film's greatest strength and the primary reason for its critical undervaluation. A film that presents itself as a broad comedy will be evaluated as a broad comedy. Critics who came to Big Momma's House 2 expecting a lazy sequel found a lazy sequel because that is what they were looking for. Viewers who came without that expectation, who simply sat with the film and let it tell its story, often found something that surprised them, something warmer and stranger and more human than the marketing promised. The film was never going to win awards, but it deserved a more honest, critical engagement than it received, and 2 decades later that engagement is overdue. The question of what Big Momma's House 2 is saying about fatherhood is one that the film poses quietly and answers obliquely, which is appropriate because fatherhood is a subject that resists the kind of direct statement that comedies usually prefer. Malcolm Turner is, at the beginning of this film, a man who is about to become a father and who has almost no honest relationship with what that means. He understands fatherhood in the abstract. He knows the responsibilities. He has made the promises. He has bought the baby clothes and attended the doctor's appointments and said all the right things to the woman carrying his child. But his understanding is intellectual rather than felt. It is the understanding of a man who has studied the role rather than lived it. What the Cheshire Children give him, what Molly and Carrie and Andrew give him, completely without intending to, is an education in what fatherhood actually requires. It requires showing up. It requires paying attention to the specific, particular person in front of you rather than the general category of child you believe you are caring for. It requires the willingness to be embarrassed, to be vulnerable, to be present in situations that are uncomfortable and inconvenient and that offer no professional advantage whatsoever. Malcolm learns all of this inside the Big Momma suit, in a house he entered under false pretenses, caring for children who are not his. And when he holds his own son for the first time, at the end of the film, the audience understands something that Malcolm himself is only beginning to understand. He is finally ready. There is a specific kind of loneliness that the film understands and renders with unusual precision. The loneliness of a person who is surrounded by people who care about them, but who cannot be fully reached by any of that care because they have built so many layers of performance between themselves and the world that genuine contact has become impossible. Malcolm Turner is that person at the beginning of Big Momma's House 2. He loves Sheila. He knows he loves her. He can describe that love in complete sentences and mean every word, but he cannot be fully present with her because being fully present would require dismantling the professional identity that gives his life its structure and meaning, and he does not know who he is without that structure. The Big Momma suit, paradoxically, strips that professional identity away. Inside the suit, Malcolm Turner the FBI agent does not exist. There is only Big Momma, who has no professional reputation to protect, no career trajectory to manage, no identity built on competence and authority and the respect of colleagues. Big Momma can be ridiculous. Big Momma can be wrong. Big Momma can need things from the people around her without it meaning anything about her worth or her capability. And in that freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to be present, to need and be needed without professional consequence, Malcolm discovers what he has been missing. The suit is not a prison. It is, structurally and emotionally, the only place Malcolm Turner has ever been truly free. The film's comedy, when examined through this lens, takes on a different character entirely. Every slapstick sequence, every moment of physical comedy, every scene where Big Momma's implausible body causes chaos in a domestic environment, all of it is a form of productive humiliation. Malcolm is a man who has spent his career being competent, capable, and in control. Big Momma is none of those things, at least not in conventional terms. She is physically improbable, socially excessive, and constitutionally incapable of maintaining the kind of controlled professional distance that Malcolm relies on. She gets things wrong. She makes messes. She embarrasses herself in front of people and does not stop to manage the impression she is making because there is no impression to manage. And every time this happens, every time the comedy of Big Momma's physical existence strips Malcolm of the armor of his professional competence, he becomes more human, more available, more genuinely present than he has been in years. The laughter the film generates is real and earned and deserves to be appreciated on its own terms. But it is also doing something that goes beyond entertainment. It is systematically dismantling the identity that has been preventing Malcolm Turner from being the person his life is asking him to be. Comedy, at its best, has always been a form of therapy. Big Momma's House 2 understands this and uses it deliberately. Would you have put on that suit? That is the question at the heart of this film, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment before the analysis moves toward its conclusion. Not the question of whether you would have taken the assignment. That is a question about professional obligation and is relatively simple to answer. The harder question is whether you would have allowed what Malcolm allowed to happen inside that assignment. Whether you would have let yourself be changed by the children you were supposed to be observing. Whether you would have let Molly's anger matter to you. Let Carrie's anxiety reach you. Let Andrew's need for attention feel like your responsibility to meet. Most people, in Malcolm's position, would have maintained professional distance. Would have reminded themselves that these are not their children, that this is not their family, that their job is to gather intelligence and get out. Malcolm does not do that. He could not do that. Maybe, or maybe, somewhere beneath the layers of professional competence and masculine performance, he chose not to. He chose to be moved. He chose to let the lives around him matter beyond the operational frame. And that choice, unmandated, unprofessional, and entirely human, is what transforms Big Mama's House 2 from a comedy about a man in a suit into a story about what it costs to remain genuinely open to the world even when your job, your identity, and your carefully constructed sense of yourself are all telling you to close off. The legacy of Big Mama's House 2 is worth considering at this stage of the analysis, because it is a film that has been consistently misunderstood in ways that reveal something interesting about how audiences and critics process comedy. The film made over $138 million at the worldwide box office on a production budget of approximately $40 million. By any commercial measure, it was a significant success. Its critical reception was almost uniformly dismissive, a Rotten Tomatoes score that reflects the consensus view that it was a cynical, formulaic, unnecessary sequel that offered nothing beyond the diminishing returns of a concept that had already been fully explored in the original film. The gap between that commercial success and that critical dismissal is not unusual for studio comedies of this era. What is unusual is the persistence with which audiences have returned to this film in the years since its release, not out of ironic nostalgia or guilty pleasure, but because something in it continues to resonate. The warmth is real. The emotional stakes are real. Martin Lawrence's performance is real. And the story the film is telling, beneath its broad comedy surface, is a story about things that matter. About the gap between the person we perform and the person we are, about what it costs to remain closed to the people who love us, and about the unexpected ways in which we sometimes discover ourselves. Those are not the themes of a cynical cash grab. Those are the themes of a film that was trying to say something true. The screenplay of Big Mama's House 2, written by Don Reimer, is a document that deserves more careful attention than it has received, because it is doing several things simultaneously that are harder to execute than they appear. The surface structure is familiar: undercover agent, fish out of water scenario, comedy of disguise, thriller subplot, domestic emotional arc, resolution. These are the conventional elements of a genre that has been thoroughly explored, and Reimer deploys them with professional competence. But beneath the surface structure is a second architecture that is considerably more ambitious, a sustained parallel between Malcolm's deception of the Cheshire family and his deception of Sheila, a running commentary on the relationship between performance and identity, and a genuine attempt to complicate the moral position of a protagonist who is doing something objectively problematic for reasons that are genuinely sympathetic. The screenplay never quite achieves the level of thematic integration that would make it a great script. There are scenes that exist only to generate comedy and that contribute nothing to the emotional or thematic architecture of the film. There are moments where the thriller subplot and the domestic arc feel like two separate films running alongside each other rather than a unified narrative. And the villain, Cheshire, is never developed with the depth that his structural function in the story requires. He is a mirror for Malcolm's double life, but the mirror is too underdeveloped to do its full reflective work. These are real weaknesses, but they are the weaknesses of a screenplay that was attempting something ambitious and falling short, not the weaknesses of a screenplay that was not attempting anything at all. The critical consensus got the failure right and the ambition completely wrong. The direction of John Whitesell sits inside the mainstream Hollywood comedy tradition in ways that are largely invisible precisely because they are so competent. Whitesell does not have the authorial distinctiveness of a filmmaker whose visual choices announce themselves as deliberate and meaningful. He is not that kind of director. What he is, and what this film demonstrates clearly once you are looking for it, is a filmmaker who understands the emotional architecture of the material he is working with and makes staging and pacing decisions that serve that architecture without calling attention to themselves. The way he handles the transition from comedy to emotional sincerity in the Malcolm-Sheila scenes is the clearest example of this. These scenes require a complete tonal shift from the broad physical comedy that surrounds them, and Whitesell makes that shift without preparation or announcement. He simply stops the comedy and lets the scene breathe. The camera gets closer, the cutting slows down, the performances change register. together. And it works, not because of any single directorial decision that can be pointed to and praised, but because all of the decisions work together in service of the emotional reality of the scene. That kind of invisible competence is consistently undervalued in critical discourse because it cannot be easily described, but its absence is immediately felt. The fact that the emotional scenes in Big Momma's House 2 land as cleanly as they do is a testament to direction that knew exactly what it was doing and chose to do it quietly. The music of Richard Gibbs, who composed the score for Big Momma's House 2, is one of the film's most quietly effective elements and one of the most consistently overlooked. Film scores in studio comedies are frequently treated as functional wallpaper, present to signal emotional beats that the dialogue and performance have not fully established, absent from critical conversation because they are doing their job too efficiently to be noticed. Gibbs's score for this film operates on the same principle of productive invisibility. In the comedy sequences, the music amplifies physical gags without leading the audience toward laughter. It supports rather than instructs. In the emotional scenes, particularly the Malcolm Carey garden sequence and the farewell scenes with the children, the score pulls back in ways that allow the silence between notes to carry as much weight as the notes themselves. The most interesting musical choice in the film is the recurring motif associated with Big Momma, a theme that begins as broad and comedic and gradually, over the course of the film, acquires an emotional warmth that it did not have at the beginning. By the time the farewell scenes arrive, that motif carries the accumulated weight of everything Big Momma has become to the Cheshire Children. That kind of musical development, subtle and cumulative and in service of character rather than entertainment, is craft. It is not the craft of a great film score, but it is the craft of a filmmaker and a composer who understood that the story they were telling had an emotional depth worth serving. Nia Long's performance as Sheila deserves its own sustained analysis, because she is doing something in this film that is consistently underacknowledged in the conversation about what makes it work. Sheila is structurally the most challenging role in the screenplay. She is the character who is most directly wronged by the protagonist's choices, the character whose emotional reality is most consistently subordinated to the demands of the plot, and the character who is asked to extend grace and forgiveness in circumstances that make grace and forgiveness genuinely difficult to justify. In lesser hands, Sheila would simply be the loyal wife, a character defined by her relationship to the protagonist and by the emotional generosity she is required to demonstrate toward him. Long refuses this. From her first scene, she establishes Sheila as a woman with her own interiority, her own reserves of intelligence and perception, and her own set of judgments about the situation she is in that are entirely independent of what the script requires her to feel. When she arrives at the Cheshire household and discovers her husband in the Big Momma suit, the sequence of emotions that crosses her face is not the sequence the comedy requires. It is the sequence a real woman would actually experience. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, anger, and then, underneath all of it, the specific grief of a woman who has caught the person she loves in a lie that confirms something she already suspected. Long plays all of that in a single scene, with almost no dialogue to support her, in the middle of a studio comedy about a man in a fat suit. That is exceptional work. It deserves to be said clearly. The supporting cast of Big Momma's House 2 is one of its genuine pleasures, and the film's ability to populate the Cheshire household with characters who feel like people rather than functions is a significant part of why its emotional stakes land as well as they do. Emily Procter as Leah Cheshire brings a quality of contained intelligence to a role that could easily have been played as simple obliviousness. Her Leah is watchful in the specific way of a woman who has learned to manage what she sees rather than respond to it, a performance choice that makes the character's eventual confrontation with reality feel genuinely earned rather than dramatically convenient. Mark Moses as Fuller Cheshire navigates the difficult task of playing a character who must be convincingly dangerous without being cartoonishly villainous, and he brings enough specificity to the performance that Cheshire feels like a real person making real choices rather than a plot mechanism in a suit. Chloë Grace Moretz, in one of her earliest significant film roles as Carrie, brings a quietness and emotional precision to the character that is remarkable for an actor of her age. She does nothing in this film that announces itself as a performance. She simply inhabits the role with the kind of natural presence that most child actors spend years learning to achieve. Looking back at her work in Big Momma's House 2 from the vantage point of her subsequent career, it is clear that the instincts that would make her one of the finest actors of her generation were already fully formed. The film's handling of its thriller elements in Act 6 deserves examination, not because the thriller is the most important thing the film is doing, but because the way it resolves the thriller demonstrates illustrates the film's priorities with unusual clarity. The standard studio action comedy of this era would have built its climax around the operational objective, the arrest, the recovery of the classified material, the defeat of the villain. Big Momma's House 2 does not do this. It places its most emotionally intense material not in the arrest sequence, but in the conversation between Malcolm and Sheila that follows it, and in the farewell scenes between Big Momma and the Cheshire Children. The thriller resolves efficiently and without drama precisely so that the emotional story can take the space it needs. This is a structural choice, and it is a significant one. It tells us what the filmmakers believe this story was actually about. They did not believe it was about a federal agent catching a criminal. They believed it was about a man learning to be present for the people who love him, and they made their structural choices accordingly, giving the most screen time and the most emotional weight to the material that served that story rather than the material that satisfied genre expectations. The result is a film that feels unbalanced if you came for the thriller and surprisingly rich if you came for the human story. Most critics came for the thriller. Most audiences, it turns out, came for something else. The final act of Big Momma's House 2 also contains the film's most pointed commentary on the nature of institutional loyalty and what it costs. Malcolm Turner has spent his entire career serving the Bureau. He has structured his identity around that service. He has made decisions about his marriage, about his availability to the people who love him, about the kind of man he allows himself to be, in service of an institution that views him as an asset rather than a person. The Bureau sent him into the Cheshire household without full disclosure of what the operation would require emotionally and psychologically. The Bureau will debrief him, commend him for a successful operation, and move on to the next case. It will not ask how he is. It will not acknowledge what he sacrificed. It will not help him repair the damage his absence caused to his marriage or account for the children he came to care about, who will have to process the aftermath of what happened in their home without any support from the federal apparatus that caused it. Malcolm understands all of this by the time the operation concludes, and what he does with that understanding, how he integrates the knowledge that his institution will never fully account for the human cost of what it asks of him, is the quietest and most mature thing the film does. He does not quit. He does not rage against the institution. He simply decides, without announcement or drama, to be more honest with himself and with Sheila about what the job is and what it costs. That is not a revolution. It is an adjustment. But adjustments, honestly made and actually kept, are how real people change. The all-is-lost moment in Big Momma's House 2 arrives not in the thriller narrative, but in the domestic one, and it arrives quietly enough that it is easy to miss if you are watching the film as a comedy rather than as a character study. It happens in a phone call. Malcolm is in the Cheshire household several weeks into the operation, and he calls Sheila from a bathroom at midnight. She picks up. She sounds tired in the specific way of a heavily pregnant woman who has been managing alone for weeks and has reached the point where exhaustion and loneliness have begun to feel indistinguishable from each other. She does not ask him when he is coming home. She has stopped asking that. She asks him, instead, whether he is eating. It is the smallest possible question. It is also the most devastating question in the film, because in that question, in the fact that she has retreated from wanting him home to simply wanting him to take care of himself in his absence, the film shows us the exact contour of what Malcolm has lost. She is no longer reaching for him. She has moved into a mode of patient, private survival that does not include him in its calculations. She loves him. She will keep loving him. But she has closed a door that was open before he left, and Malcolm, sitting on a bathroom floor in someone else's house at midnight, understands in this moment that he may not be able to open it again simply by coming home. Speed is not enough here. Every advantage he thought he had in this relationship, her patience, her trust, her willingness to believe his explanations, is gone. This is not a setback. This is the end of everything he believed about himself as a husband, and the comedy around it never acknowledges it. That is exactly right. What makes this moment the film's true emotional nadir rather than the obvious plot-level crisis points is what it reveals about the nature of marital damage. Malcolm has been lying to Sheila for the entirety of this operation. He has lied about where he is, what he is doing, why he cannot come home, and when he will be back. Those lies are the operational ones, the ones he could, with some justification, frame as professional necessity. But the damage they have done is not operational. It is relational. It is the accumulated weight of weeks of absence during a pregnancy, weeks during which Sheila has been forced to conclude that whatever her husband says he is doing, what he is actually doing is choosing the work over her again. She has reached a point of private accommodation, a place where she manages his absence rather than fighting it, because fighting it has never changed the outcome. That accommodation is the damage, not the anger, not the confrontation, but the quiet closing of a door that was once open wide. Malcolm cannot fix this with an apology or an explanation. He cannot fix it it with the truth about the operation, because the truth about the operation is simply a more detailed version of the same story she already knows. He chose. He always chooses. And the question now is not whether she can forgive him for choosing, but whether she has enough left to care whether he chooses differently next time. That is the all is lost moment in Big Mama's house too. It happens in a bathroom at midnight. It arrives in a question about whether he is eating, and it is the most honest thing the film does. The film's recovery from this moment, its second act reversal, to use the structural language, is Sheila's arrival at the Cheshire household. But the recovery is not what it appears to be. On the surface, Sheila's arrival is the comic complication. The wife showing up to discover the husband in the fat suit is a setup for the kind of broad situational comedy that the film has been delivering throughout. And the comedy is real, the scene is funny. But beneath the comedy, what Sheila's arrival actually represents is an act of will. She could have stayed home. She could have continued the pattern of patient, private management that has characterized the later weeks of his absence. She chose not to. She got on a plane. She found him. She showed up. And showing up, the act of refusing the accommodation, refusing the managed distance, refusing to continue functioning as if his absence were an acceptable condition of her life, is the act that makes the rest of the film's emotional resolution possible. Sheila does not save Malcolm's marriage by forgiving him. She saves it by refusing to let him disappear without consequence. She saves it by being present enough, furious enough, and real enough to make his absence cost him something visible rather than something he can manage from a distance. The comedy frames this as the wife catching the husband. The emotional reality is a woman refusing to be abandoned gracefully. What the film asks us to feel in the space between Malcolm's all is lost moment and Sheila's arrival is something that most studio comedies are not willing to sit inside. The specific quality of guilt that belongs to a person who has made the same mistake so many times that even they can no longer frame it as a mistake. Malcolm knows what he is doing. He has always known what he is doing. He is not deceived about his own nature or his own choices. He is simply unwilling, until this moment, to let that knowledge cost him anything. The guilt he feels sitting on that bathroom floor is not the guilt of a man who did not know better. It is the guilt of a man who knew exactly what he was choosing and chose it anyway, and is now sitting with the full weight of that choice in a way that his professional success and his operational effectiveness cannot insulate him from any longer. That specific quality of guilt, the guilt that has no excuse because you always understood what you were doing, is one of the most uncomfortable human experiences there is. And the fact that Big Mama's House 2 finds it, renders it accurately, and builds its emotional resolution around it rather than around a simpler, more forgivable version of the same feeling, is evidence that the film was doing something genuinely considered beneath its comedy surface. Tell me in the comments, when you watched Malcolm in that bathroom scene, did you feel sorry for him, or did you feel the specific discomfort of recognizing something in him that you would rather not have recognized in yourself? The film's treatment of Kevin's death, the event that sets the entire plot in motion, is worth returning to at this stage of the analysis because it is handled in a way that reveals something essential about Malcolm's psychology and about the film's understanding of masculine grief. Kevin is never seen. He exists in the film entirely as an absence, a name spoken by Malcolm's supervisor, a photograph on a desk, a memory that Malcolm carries silently through every scene of the operation. The film does not give us flashbacks to their partnership. It does not dramatize their friendship. It simply tells us that Kevin is dead and that Malcolm feels responsible, and leaves the audience to understand, from the weight of that responsibility in every scene that follows, what the relationship must have meant. This is a confident structural choice, and it is one that most studio comedies would not have made. The temptation in this kind of film is to establish the emotional stakes explicitly, to show us Kevin alive and vital and funny and specifically missed so that his death feels like a loss we can measure. Reimer and Whitesell resist this temptation. They trust the audience to feel the weight of an absence they have never seen filled, and in doing so, they make Kevin's death function as something more than a plot trigger. It functions as a constant psychological presence in the film, the thing Malcolm cannot stop carrying, cannot stop measuring his actions against, cannot stop using as the justification for choices that deserve a more honest examination than that. Kevin is not a reason Malcolm took this assignment. Kevin is an excuse Malcolm uses to avoid asking himself the real reason. The real reason, as the film slowly makes apparent, is that Malcolm Turner is frightened, not of the operation. He is too experienced and too capable for the operation itself to frighten him. He is frightened of what comes after the operation. He is frightened of fatherhood and of marriage, and of the specific vulnerability of caring deeply about people you cannot protect through professional competence alone. The Big Mama suit is not just a professional tool. It is a retreat from the things that actually scare him. Inside the suit, the problems are clear. There is is a criminal to catch, a cover to maintain, an operation to run. Outside the suit, in the life that Sheila is building and waiting for him to inhabit, the problems are harder and less legible and cannot be solved through any amount of competence or courage or professional skill. You cannot undercover your way through a marriage. You cannot run a surveillance operation on your own emotional unavailability. And Malcolm, who has spent his entire adult life solving problems through professional action, is not equipped for the kind of problems that are waiting for him at home. The film understands this. It builds its entire emotional architecture around it, and the resolution it offers is not a resolution at all in the conventional sense. It is a beginning. Malcolm holds his son and understands what he has been afraid of. That understanding is not a cure. It is the first honest step toward one. The pacing of Big Mama's House 2 is one of the areas where the film's craft is most visible and most frequently misread. The film runs approximately 99 minutes, which is exactly right for the story it is telling. Critics who found it rushed were watching a different film, one that they expected to spend more time on the thriller subplot and the set-piece comedy and less time on the domestic emotional arc. The film's actual pacing decisions reflect its actual priorities. The sequences that are given the most time and space are the scenes between Big Mama and the Cheshire Children, the scenes between Malcolm and Sheila, and the farewell sequences at the end. The sequences that are compressed, the thriller mechanics, the bureau procedure, the action beats, are compressed precisely because they are not the point. When a film's pacing feels wrong to a critic, it is often because the critic's expectations about what the film should be prioritizing are not aligned with what the film is actually prioritizing. Big Mama's House 2 was prioritizing the human story. The critics were looking for the genre story. The pacing felt wrong to them because it was perfectly right for a different film than the one they thought they were watching. That misalignment is not the film's failure. It is a failure of expectation management, partly the marketing's responsibility and partly the critical community's tendency to evaluate comedies against the baseline of what comedies are supposed to be rather than what this particular comedy is actually attempting. The film's ending is worth examining with more care than it typically receives because it does something unusual for a studio comedy of its era. It refuses to fully resolve its central emotional question. Malcolm comes home. He is present for the birth of his son. He holds his child. He and Sheila are together. These are the conventional markers of resolution. The family reunited, the protagonist transformed, the future implied as brighter than the past. But the film does not underline any of this. It does not give Malcolm a speech about how he has changed or what he has learned. It does not give Sheila a moment of explicit forgiveness that releases the audience from the discomfort of her earlier grief. It simply shows us the two of them in a hospital room with a baby, together, in the specific silence of people who have been through something difficult and are still working out what it means. That silence is the most honest thing the ending could have done. It does not promise transformation. It acknowledges the beginning of it. A man who genuinely changes does not announce the change. He simply starts making different choices. And the film, in its final frames, trusts us to understand that the work is just beginning, that the suit is off, the operation is over, and the harder assignment is now underway. The theme of identity in Big Mama's House 2 operates on three distinct levels simultaneously. And understanding all three is necessary to understanding what the film is ultimately arguing about the relationship between performance and selfhood. The first level is the most obvious. Malcolm's performed identity as Big Mama. This is the disguise in its literal sense. The rubber suit, the voice, the mannerisms, the character that Malcolm constructs and inhabits for the duration of the operation. At this level, the film is doing what all disguise comedies do, using the physical and social comedy of a false identity to create situations that the true identity would never produce. The second level is less obvious, but more interesting. Malcolm's performed identity as a domesticated husband. The version of himself that Malcolm has been presenting to Sheila since their marriage. The man who has given up field work, who comes home every night, who has made peace with the quiet life, is also a performance. It is a performance motivated by love rather than by operational necessity, but it is a performance nonetheless, and like all performances, it has a cost. The man performing it has to suppress the part of himself that still wants the field, still answers when duty calls, still believes that the work is what makes him real. That suppression is unsustainable, and the film is the story of what happens when it finally breaks. The third level is the most uncomfortable. The possibility that neither of these performances is false, exactly because Malcolm Turner does not have a stable, unified self that exists independently of his performances. He is, like most people, the sum of the roles he plays, and the question the film poses without quite answering is which of those roles contains the most of what is actually real in him. The concept of motivated blindness that the film explores through Leah Cheshire has a direct parallel in Malcolm's self-understanding, and the film draws this parallel carefully without ever making it explicit. Leah has chosen not to see her husband clearly because seeing him clearly would require a level of disruption she is not prepared to face. Malcolm has chosen not to see himself clearly for precisely the same reason. He knows he is still drawn to field work. He knows that the quiet life he promised Sheila is not, in its entirety, the life he wants. He knows that the part of him that answered when the bureau called is not a relic of his past that he has successfully retired. It is a fundamental component of who he is. But seeing this clearly would require him to have an honest conversation with Sheila about who he actually is rather than who she agreed to marry. And that conversation frightens him more than any undercover operation ever has. So he does what Leah does. He manages the information. He takes the assignment and frames it as exceptional circumstances. He tells himself the lie he needs to tell to avoid the harder truth. And the film's most pointed structural observation is that Malcolm and Leah are in precisely the same position, both living in houses built on information they have chosen not to fully process. The difference is that Malcolm's house is metaphorical. Leah's is literal, and both of them are about to have their foundations examined in ways they did not choose and cannot control. The question of what Big Mama's House 2 owes to the tradition of Black American comedy is one that the film's critical reception has almost entirely failed to engage with, and that failure represents a significant gap in the existing analysis. Martin Lawrence's career exists within a specific lineage of Black American performance that includes Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, and Arsenio Hall, performers whose comedy operates at the intersection of physical virtuosity, social observation, and a particular kind of emotional intelligence that is simultaneously about making people laugh and about making people see something true about the world they live in. The Big Mama character, viewed within this lineage, is not simply a fat suit and a false voice. It is a character in the tradition of the trickster figure, a persona that gains access to spaces and relationships that the character's true identity would be denied, and that uses that access to do something that the dominant social order would prevent if it knew what was happening. Big Mama gains access to the Cheshire household because she is coded as non-threatening, a large, older, Black woman whose presence in a white suburban household reads as domestic and unthreatening to a man like Cheshire who has spent years managing threat assessments. What Cheshire fails to register is that Big Mama is the most dangerous person in his house. That inversion, the coded as harmless figure being the instrument of justice, is a specifically Black American comedic tradition, and Lawrence deploys it with the full weight of that tradition behind him. The film never makes this subtext explicit. It does not need to. It is operating in a register that its audience understands without being told. The relationship between the two Big Mama films, between the original and this sequel, is worth examining because the sequel's choices only make full sense in the context of what the original established. The first Big Mama's House introduced the character and the premise, and it did so with a relatively straightforward comic and thriller logic. Malcolm needs a disguise. The disguise is Big Mama. Comedic and operational complications ensue. Love interest is integrated into the resolution. It is a competent, entertaining film that does what it sets out to do without particular ambition beyond its genre. Big Mama's House 2 takes the same premise and asks a different question. What happens when a man who has already learned to wear this disguise has to wear it again? Not because he has no choice, but because the disguise has become the only way he knows how to access the parts of himself he cannot reach as Malcolm Turner? This is a significantly more interesting question than the first film asked, and the fact that it is embedded inside a broader comedy that does not announce its ambitions means that most viewers and critics engaged with the sequel as a repetition of the original rather than as an extension of it in a genuinely different direction. The original Big Mama's House is a better genre film. Big Mama's House 2 is a more interesting film about a person. These are not competing achievements. They are simply different ones, and the second film deserves to be evaluated on its own terms rather than against the baseline of the first. The film's understanding of suburban American life is sharper and more specific than its critical reputation would suggest, and it is worth examining what Big Mama's House 2 is actually saying about the particular world the Cheshire family inhabits. The suburb the Cheshires live in is presented not as a generic backdrop, but as a specific social environment with its own rules, its own anxieties, and its own particular form of collective performance. Everyone in this neighborhood is managing an image. The Cheshires manage the image of the successful, stable family. The neighbors manage their own versions of the same image. The school where Molly and Carrie are enrolled is an institution whose entire social architecture is organized around the maintenance of appearances. Into this environment of managed presentations comes Big Mama, a character who is, herself, a managed presentation, but one that operates according to completely different rules than anyone else in the neighborhood is following. Big Momma does not manage her image. She cannot manage her image because the image is already too implausible to manage carefully. She simply exists at maximum volume in every space she enters, and that refusal to manage, that absolute structural inability to perform the kind of careful self-presentation that everyone around her is engaged in, is what makes her so disruptive and so necessary. She is not a threat to the neighborhood's image. She is simply indifferent to it. And in a social environment entirely organized around the maintenance of images, indifference to that imperative is the most radical possible stance. The film's comedy of manners, its sustained observation of what people do when they believe they are being watched by the right people and what they do when they think no one is watching, runs throughout the entire film and gives Big Momma's House 2 a satirical dimension that its critics were entirely unprepared to find in a Martin Lawrence comedy sequel. Fuller Cheshire is performing trustworthiness for his family and his neighborhood while conducting a criminal enterprise. Leah is performing contentment while privately managing a growing awareness that her marriage is not what she believed it to be. Molly is performing rebellion while actually performing a very specific kind of plea for attention. Carrie is performing composure while privately drowning in anxiety. And Malcolm is performing Big Momma while actually performing Malcolm Turner performing a version of himself he hoped would be good enough. The film is, at its structural core, a catalog of performances within performances, a sustained examination of the gap between what people show and what people are. And it finds that gap everywhere it looks. In the criminal, in the wife, in the teenager, in the anxious child, and in the FBI agent who came to catch a villain and discovered, somewhere between the cheerleading practice and the midnight phone call, that the person he most needed to stop performing for was himself. What the film finally resolves, and what it deliberately leaves unresolved, tells us everything about its moral intelligence. It resolves the thriller. Cheshire is caught. The technology is recovered. The national security threat is ended. It resolves the children's immediate crises. Molly has been seen. Carrie has been comforted. Andrew has been played with. It resolves the operational question. Malcolm completes the mission successfully and is present for the birth of his son. What it does not resolve is the fundamental tension at the center of Malcolm's character, the tension between the man he performs for Sheila and the man he actually is. The film knows this tension is not resolvable in the space of a single story. It is not the kind of problem that gets solved. It is the kind of problem that gets managed imperfectly and continuously by a person who has finally decided to be honest about the fact that it exists. Malcolm does not become a different person by the end of Big Momma's House 2. He becomes a person who is no longer pretending to be a different person. That is a smaller change and a more real one. And the film, in its final frames, treats it with exactly the right amount of weight, not triumphant, not tragic, but honest, which is, it turns out, what this film has been about all along. The final question worth posing before this analysis moves to its verdict is the one that the film itself poses most quietly, in the spaces between its scenes. What do we owe the people who need us when being there for them requires us to be someone we are not? Malcolm Turner puts on a suit that makes him physically unrecognizable, enters a house under false pretenses, and becomes, for the duration of his time there, the most genuinely present adult in the lives of 3 children who desperately needed one. The care was real. The disguise was false. Both things are simultaneously true. Does the falseness of the disguise contaminate the realness of the care? Does the genuine harm of the deception outweigh the genuine good of the presence? The film does not answer this. It is not the kind of question that has an answer. It is the kind of question that has a life, one that the characters in the film will spend years working out in the aftermath of everything that happened in that house, in ways that the movie does not have the time or perhaps the courage to fully show us. But the fact that the question is there, alive in the film, unresolved and unresolvable, is the evidence that Big Momma's House 2 was doing something that mattered. Films that do not take their own questions seriously do not leave questions alive inside the audience. This one does. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The verdict on Big Momma's House 2 begins with the story, because story is the foundation on which everything else rests, and a film that does not work as a story cannot be redeemed by analysis. The story of Big Momma's House 2 works. It works because it has a clear central character with a clearly defined internal conflict, because that conflict is expressed through action rather than explanation, and because the resolution of that conflict is earned by what the character goes through rather than simply declared at the end. Malcolm Turner starts this film as a man who has substituted professional identity for personal honesty and ends it as a man who has been forced, by circumstances partly of his own making, to face what that substitution has cost him. That is a complete character arc. It is not a particularly original character arc. The same arc appears in dozens of films across dozens of genres, but originality of concept is not what makes a character arc work. What makes it work is execution, and the execution here is more consistent and more committed than the film's reputation suggests. The story also works as a comedy, which is not a trivial achievement. The comedy and the drama do not undermine each other. They are, as this analysis has argued throughout, the same thing, two registers for exploring the same truth about the same character. When the comedy lands, it lands because it is in service of something real. When the drama lands, it lands because the comedy has established the emotional foundation that makes the drama possible. That integration is the film's most significant structural accomplishment, and it is one that requires more craft to achieve than its casual execution suggests. The characters in Big Momma's House 2 are, on balance, more developed and more believable than the film's genre and budget would typically support. Malcolm is the most fully realized, for the reasons this analysis has explored at length. But the supporting characters, Molly in particular, and Sheila and Leah, are drawn with enough specificity that they feel like people with inner lives rather than functions. The film's weakest character, by some distance, is Fuller Cheshire. As the villain of the thriller narrative, he is required to be both convincingly dangerous and convincingly domestic, and the screenplay never quite integrates these two requirements. Cheshire is dangerous when the film needs him to be dangerous and domestic when the film needs him to be domestic, but the transition between these modes never feels fully earned. We never understand what drives him. What combination of greed, ideology, and rationalization leads a man to sell classified military technology while coaching his son's Little League team? The film is not interested enough in Cheshire to answer that question, and the lack of interest shows. A villain who is more fully developed would have made the mirroring between Cheshire and Malcolm, both men living double lives in the same house, far more resonant than it ultimately is. This is the screenplay's most significant missed opportunity, and it is significant enough to register as a genuine weakness in a film that otherwise handles its character work with considerable care. The direction of Big Momma's House 2 serves the story without calling attention to itself, which is the appropriate ambition for this kind of film and the appropriate measure of its success. Whitesell is not a stylist. He does not impose a visual identity on the material that would distinguish his work from the work of a dozen other competent Hollywood directors working in the same genre at the same time. What he does is stage scenes with clarity, pace the film with intelligence, and make tonal transitions that the material requires without fumbling them. The cheerleading sequence is well staged. The surveillance sequences are efficiently handled. The emotional scenes are given the space they need. The editing, by Mark Helfrich, serves the comedy in the action sequences and retreats into invisibility in the emotional ones, which is exactly what good editing does. The cinematography by Anthony B. Richmond does not distinguish itself, but it does not need to. This is not a film that requires a distinctive visual language, and a cinematographer who understood that and executed accordingly made the right professional call. The craft of Big Momma's House 2 is the craft of competent execution in service of material, and competent execution in service of material is underrated as a cinematic achievement precisely because it does not announce itself. The film does not look like a film with something to prove. It looks like a film that knows what it is doing. Those are not the same thing, and the latter is harder to achieve. The emotional impact of Big Momma's House 2 is the most subjective element of the verdict, and the most honest thing that can be said about it is that it is real for viewers who come to the film without the expectation that it should not be. The film earns its biggest emotional moments. The farewell between Big Momma and the Cheshire children lands with genuine feeling because the film has done the work of establishing why these relationships matter. The Malcolm-Sheila reconciliation lands because Nia Long's performance has given Sheila a genuine inner life that makes her grace feel costly rather than convenient. The final scene in the hospital lands because the film has been honest about what Malcolm has risked and what it would mean to lose it. None of these moments are the product of cheap manipulation. No swelling orchestral music that tells the audience what to feel before the scene has earned the right to ask for it. No dialogue that explains the emotion the actors are already conveying perfectly well. The emotional intelligence of Big Momma's House 2 is the most unexpected thing about it, and the thing that its critics were least equipped to acknowledge. It is a film that respects its audience enough to earn its feelings rather than simply demanding them. That respect is rarer than it should be in studio comedies, and it deserves to be acknowledged clearly. The film's single most significant weakness, and the verdict requires honesty about this, is the underdevelopment of its thriller narrative relative to the ambitions of its domestic emotional arc. The two stories need each other. Without the thriller, Malcolm has no reason to be in the Cheshire household, and without the domestic arc, the thriller thriller has no emotional stakes, but they need each other in different proportions than the film ultimately achieves. The thriller provides the premise and the plot engine, and it does both of these things adequately. What it does not do is provide genuine dramatic tension of its own. Cheshire is never frightening enough, the operational stakes are never visceral enough, and the climax of the thriller narrative is resolved too cleanly and too quickly to feel like a genuine dramatic payoff. The result is that the film's second half is structurally imbalanced. The emotional domestic material carries far more weight than the thriller, and the thriller, having been asked to carry the first half, delivers a climax that feels proportionally inadequate to the emotional material that surrounds it. A stronger screenplay would have found a way to make the thriller's resolution feel as emotionally costly as the domestic resolution. This screenplay does not quite manage it. That is a specific, evidenced failure of craft, and it is the failure that most clearly separates Big Momma's House 2 from the films in its disguised comedy tradition that it is otherwise meaningfully comparable to. The overall recommendation for Big Momma's House 2 is qualified but genuine. This is a film worth watching, and worth watching with more attention than its marketing or its critical reputation would suggest it deserves. It is not a great film. It is not a film that belongs in the same conversation as the best examples of the disguised comedy tradition. It is a film that is doing something genuinely interesting inside a commercial format that actively discourages genuine interest and that manages to deliver real emotional intelligence alongside real physical comedy without allowing either to completely overwhelm the other. The comedy is funny. The drama is real. The performances, particularly from Martin Lawrence and Nia Long, are better than anyone has given them credit for. And the story, beneath its genre conventions and its studio polish, is a story about something that matters. The cost of hiding from the people who love you inside the comfortable fiction of who you wish you were, and what it takes to finally stop. Big Momma's House 2 is recommended with particular enthusiasm for viewers who responded to the emotional texture of Mrs. Doubtfire or the identity complications of Tootsie. Audiences drawn to stories where the disguise is less interesting than what the person inside it is discovering about themselves. It is recommended for viewers who have ever felt the specific discomfort of being more honest with strangers than with the people closest to them. It is recommended for viewers who appreciated Martin Lawrence's dramatic range in Blue Streak or Bad Boys and want to see that range deployed inside a comedy that gives it genuine material to work with. And it is recommended for viewers who are willing to look past a film's critical reputation to ask what the film is actually doing, who understand that dismissal is rarely the same thing as evaluation, and that a studio comedy sequel can contain genuine human truth even when the people paid to evaluate it were looking for something else entirely. What Big Momma's House 2 is not recommended for is viewers who require their comedies to be either pure genre entertainment or formally ambitious art cinema. This film occupies the uncomfortable middle space between those categories, and that middle space requires a certain tolerance for unevenness, for moments where the comedy undercuts the drama and moments where the drama undercuts the comedy, for a thriller that does not fully deliver on its promises, for a villain who deserved more development than he received. These are real limitations. A viewer with low tolerance for them will find a film that does not quite hold together. A viewer with higher tolerance will find a film that, at its best moments, does something that studio comedies are not supposed to be able to do. It makes you feel something true about what it costs to be a person who loves people and keeps finding reasons to be somewhere else. The audience that Big Momma's House 2 was made for. The audience that showed up in 2006 and made it a significant commercial success and has continued returning to it in the years since, understood something that the critical community did not. They understood that the film was for them, not for people who read reviews, not for people who evaluate comedies against formal standards developed for different kinds of films, for people who have felt the specific weight of a responsibility they did not ask for and chose to carry anyway, for people who have ever been more present for someone else's family than for their own, for people who know what it costs to keep choosing work over love and keep telling themselves it is the last time. That audience knew what this film was about. They did not need to be told. And 20 years later, they are still right. The verdict on Big Momma's House 2 begins with the story, because story is the foundation on which everything else rests, and a film that does not work as a story cannot be redeemed by analysis. The story of Big Momma's House 2 works. It works because it has a clear central character with a clearly defined internal conflict, because that conflict is expressed through action rather than explanation, and because the resolution of that conflict is earned by what the character goes through rather than simply declared at the end. Malcolm Turner starts this film as a man who has substituted professional identity for personal honesty and ends it as a man who has been forced, by circumstances partly of his own making, to face what that substitution has cost him. That That is a complete character arc. It is not a particularly original character arc. The same arc appears in dozens of films across dozens of genres, but originality of concept is not what makes a character arc work. What makes it work is execution, and the execution here is more consistent and more committed than the film's reputation suggests. The story also works as a comedy, which is not a trivial achievement. The comedy and the drama do not undermine each other. They are, as this analysis has argued throughout, the same thing, two registers for exploring the same truth about the same character. When the comedy lands, it lands because it is in service of something real. When the drama lands, it lands because the comedy has established the emotional foundation that makes the drama possible. That integration is the film's most significant structural accomplishment, and it is one that requires more craft to achieve than its casual execution suggests. The characters in Big Momma's House 2 are, on balance, more developed and more believable than the film's genre and budget would typically support. Malcolm is the most fully realized, for the reasons this analysis has explored at length. But the supporting characters, Molly in particular, and Sheila, and Leah, are drawn with enough specificity that they feel like people with inner lives rather than functions. The film's weakest character, by some distance, is Fuller Cheshire. As the villain of the thriller narrative, he is required to be both convincingly dangerous and convincingly domestic, and the screenplay never quite integrates these two requirements. Cheshire is dangerous when the film needs him to be dangerous and domestic when the film needs him to be domestic, but the transition between these modes never feels fully earned. We never understand what drives him. What combination of greed, ideology, and rationalization leads a man to sell classified military technology while coaching his son's Little League team? The film is not interested enough in Cheshire to answer that question, and the lack of interest shows. A villain who is more fully developed would have made the mirroring between Cheshire and Malcolm, both men living double lives in the same house, far more resonant than it ultimately is. This is the screenplay's most significant missed opportunity, and it is significant enough to register as a genuine weakness in a film that otherwise handles its character work with considerable care. The direction of Big Momma's House 2 serves the story without calling attention to itself, which is the appropriate ambition for this kind of film and the appropriate measure of its success. Whitesell is not a stylist. He does not impose a visual identity on the material that would distinguish his work from the work of a dozen other competent Hollywood directors working in the same genre at the same time. What he does is stage scenes with clarity, pace the film with intelligence, and make tonal transitions that the material requires without fumbling them. The cheerleading sequence is well staged. The surveillance sequences are efficiently handled. The emotional scenes are given the space they need. The editing, by Mark Helfrich, serves the comedy in the action sequences and retreats into invisibility in the emotional ones, which is exactly what good editing does. The cinematography by Anthony B. Richmond does not distinguish itself, but it does not need to. This is not a film that requires a distinctive visual language, and a cinematographer who understood that and executed accordingly made the right professional call. The craft of Big Momma's House 2 is the craft of competent execution in service of material, and competent execution in service of material is underrated as a cinematic achievement precisely because it does not announce itself. The film does not look like a film with something to prove. It looks like a film that knows what it is doing. Those are not the same thing, and the latter is harder to achieve. The emotional impact of Big Momma's House 2 is the most subjective element of the verdict, and the most honest thing that can be said about it is that it is real for viewers who come to the film without the expectation that it should not be. The film earns its biggest emotional moments. The farewell between Big Momma and the Cheshire children lands with genuine feeling because the film has done the work of establishing why these relationships matter. The Malcolm-Sheila reconciliation lands because Nia Long's performance has given Sheila a genuine inner life that makes her grace feel costly rather than convenient. The final scene in the hospital lands because the film has been honest about what Malcolm has risked and what it would mean to lose it. None of these moments are the product of cheap manipulation. No swelling orchestral music that tells the audience what to feel before the scene has earned the right to ask for it. No dialogue that explains the emotion the actors are already conveying perfectly well. The emotional intelligence of Big Momma's House 2 is the most unexpected thing about it, and the thing that its critics were least equipped to acknowledge. It is a film that respects its audience enough to earn its feelings rather than simply demanding them. That respect is rarer than it should be in studio comedies, and it deserves to be acknowledged clearly. The film's single most significant weakness, and the verdict requires honesty about this, is the underdevelopment of its thriller narrative relative to the ambitions of its domestic emotional arc. The two stories need each other. Without the thriller, Malcolm has no reason to be in the Cheshire household, and without the domestic arc, the thriller has no emotional stakes. But they need each other in different proportions than the film ultimately achieves. The thriller provides the premise and the plot engine, and it does both of these things adequately. What it does not do is provide genuine dramatic tension of its own. Cheshire is never frightening enough, the operational stakes are never visceral enough, and the climax of the thriller narrative is resolved too cleanly and too quickly to feel like a genuine dramatic payoff. The result is that the film's second half is structurally imbalanced. The emotional domestic material carries far more weight than the thriller, and the thriller, having been asked to carry the first half, delivers a climax that feels proportionally inadequate to the emotional material that surrounds it. A stronger screenplay would have found a way to make the thriller's resolution feel as emotionally costly as the domestic resolution. This screenplay does not quite manage it. That is a specific, evidenced failure of craft, and it is the failure that most clearly separates Big Momma's House 2 from the films in its disguised comedy tradition that it is otherwise meaningfully comparable to. The overall recommendation for Big Momma's House 2 is qualified but genuine. This is a film worth watching, and worth watching with more attention than its marketing or its critical reputation would suggest it deserves. It is not a great film. It is not a film that belongs in the same conversation as the best examples of the disguised comedy tradition. It is a film that is doing something genuinely interesting inside a commercial format that actively discourages genuine interest and that manages to deliver real emotional intelligence alongside real physical comedy without allowing either to completely overwhelm the other. The comedy is funny. The drama is real. The performances, particularly from Martin Lawrence and Nia Long, are better than anyone has given them credit for. And the story, beneath its genre conventions and its studio polish, is a story about something that matters. The cost of hiding from the people who love you inside the comfortable fiction of who you wish you were, and what it takes to finally stop. Big Momma's House 2 is recommended with particular enthusiasm for viewers who responded to the emotional texture of Mrs. Doubtfire or the identity complications of Tootsie. Audiences drawn to stories where the disguise is less interesting than what the person inside it is discovering about themselves. It is recommended for viewers who have ever felt the specific discomfort of being more honest with strangers than with the people closest to them. It is recommended for viewers who appreciated Martin Lawrence's dramatic range in Blue Streak or Bad Boys and want to see that range deployed inside a comedy that gives it genuine material to work with. And it is recommended for viewers who are willing to look past a film's critical reputation to ask what the film is actually doing, who understand that dismissal is rarely the same thing as evaluation, and that a studio comedy sequel can contain genuine human truth even when the people paid to evaluate it were looking for something else entirely. What Big Momma's House 2 is not recommended for is viewers who require their comedies to be either pure genre entertainment or formally ambitious art cinema. This film occupies the uncomfortable middle space between those categories, and that middle space requires a certain tolerance for unevenness, for moments where the comedy undercuts the drama and moments where the drama undercuts the comedy, for a thriller that does not fully deliver on its promises, for a villain who deserved more development than he received. These are real limitations. A viewer with low tolerance for them will find a film that does not quite hold together. A viewer with higher tolerance will find a film that, at its best moments, does something that studio comedies are not supposed to be able to do. It makes you feel something true about what it costs to be a person who loves people and keeps finding reasons to be somewhere else. The audience that Big Momma's House 2 was made for. The audience that showed up in 2006 and made it a significant commercial success and has continued returning to it in the years since, understood something that the critical community did not. They understood that the film was for them, not for people who read reviews, not for people who evaluate comedies against formal standards developed for different kinds of films, for people who have felt the specific weight of a responsibility they did not ask for and chose to carry anyway, for people who have ever been more present for someone else's family than for their own, for people who know what it costs to keep choosing work over love and keep telling themselves it is the last time. That audience knew what this film was about. They did not need to be told, and 20 years later, they are still right. The ending of Big Momma's House 2 means something specific, and it is worth arriving at that specific meaning carefully rather than settling for the general impression the film leaves. The final image is Malcolm Turner holding his newborn son in a hospital room while Sheila watches from the bed. That image is not a symbol of triumph. It is not the conventional comedic resolution. Hero gets the girl, hero wins the case. Hero rides off into a future that the film has earned the right to imply will be better than the past. It is something quieter and more honest than that. It is an image of beginning. Malcolm is holding a person who does not yet know who his father is, who has no expectations, no history, no accumulated unresolved grievances from years of watching his father choose the work. The slate is clean, and Malcolm, who has spent the entire film running from the implications of that slate, who took an undercover assignment specifically to avoid confronting the life that was waiting for him, is finally still. He is not performing. He is not managing. He is not constructing a version of himself that will satisfy the Bureau or deceive Cheshire or reassure Sheila or maintain the fiction of the domesticated agent who gave up field work. He is simply a man holding his son, and the film, with considerable intelligence, does not tell us what happens next. It does not promise us that Malcolm will be a good father or a fully honest husband or a man who finally, permanently, stops choosing the work when the work calls. It shows us a man who is present for the first time in the film without a disguise of any kind. What he does with that presence is the story the film does not have time to tell, but it is the story that matters most. And leaving it unfinished is the most honest thing the ending could have done. The themes of Big Mama's House 2 converge in that final image in ways that reward the kind of careful attention this analysis has been giving them. The film is about identity, about the gap between who we perform and who we are, about the disguises we wear for the people who love us and the disguises we wear for ourselves, about the terrifying possibility that there is no stable self underneath all the performance and that we are, in some fundamental sense, whoever we are pretending to be at any given moment. Malcolm's journey through this film is the journey of a man who discovers that the truest version of himself was available all along, but that accessing it required stripping away every layer of professional identity and social performance that he had constructed around it. The Big Mama suit, which looks from the outside like the most extreme possible version of a false identity, turns out to be the one context in which Malcolm's true self can emerge. That paradox is the film's central insight, and it is an insight that extends beyond the specific circumstances of one FBI agent's undercover operation into something genuinely universal. We are all, in some way, wearing suits. We are all, in some way, more honest with strangers than with the people we love. We are all, in some way, discovering that the version of ourselves we perform for the world has started to feel more real than the version underneath it. Big Mama's House 2 finds this truth inside a studio comedy about a man in a fat suit. That is not a small accomplishment. That is the specific kind of magic that the best popular art performs, finding something true about human experience inside the most unlikely possible container. The redemption arc in Big Mama's House 2 is the film's most morally complicated element, and any honest analysis of the ending has to reckon with whether Malcolm actually earns the grace the film extends to him. He has lied to his pregnant wife about where he is and what he is doing. He has made unilateral decisions about risk that directly affect her and their unborn child. He has prioritized his guilt about a dead colleague and his compulsion toward field work over his obligations to the person who is carrying his child alone in their empty house. These are not trivial failures. They are the kind of failures that, in a more realistic film, would carry consequences that cannot be resolved in a hospital room scene. The film does not ignore this. Sheila's arrival at the Cheshire household, her fury, her grief, her conditional willingness to stay and help, all of it registers the genuine weight of what Malcolm has done. But the film ultimately offers him redemption, and the question worth asking is whether that redemption is earned or simply granted by the narrative because the genre requires it. The answer, if you have been paying attention to what Nia Long has been doing throughout the film, is that the redemption is earned, but earned by Sheila, not by Malcolm. She extends grace to a man who has not fully deserved it because she has decided, with full information and full awareness of what she is doing, that the marriage matters more than the grievance. That is not weakness. That is a form of moral courage that the film presents honestly and without sentimentality. Malcolm does not earn his redemption. Sheila chooses to give it to him. There is a significant difference. The final line of this analysis, the thought that this review will leave with you, belongs not to the verdict or the thematic summation, but to the question that Big Mama's House 2 poses in its quietest moments and never quite answers. It is a question about presence, about what it means to be truly there for someone, not physically present, not performatively attentive, not managing the impression you are making, but genuinely, vulnerably, completely there. Malcolm Turner spends the first half of this film running from that kind of presence. He runs from it in his marriage, in his approach to his impending fatherhood, in the professional identity he has constructed to avoid having to be fully present with the things that frighten him. And then he puts on a rubber suit and enters a stranger's house and finds, somewhere between a cheerleading practice and a midnight phone call and a 6-year-old boy who just wanted someone to play with him, that presence is not something you perform. It is something you choose, over and over again, in the small moments and the large ones. In the moments when no one is watching and the case is closed and the suit is off and the only thing left is the actual life life that is waiting for you to finally show up for it. That is what this film is about. Not the suit, not the case, not the comedy or the thriller or the sequel formula or the box office numbers. The question of whether you are actually there for the people who need you, and whether, when the moment finally arrives that makes it impossible to keep pretending you have enough left to choose to be. The interpretation of what the ending of Big Momma's House 2 truly means, as opposed to what it appears to mean on the surface, requires one final look at the structural choice the film makes in its closing minutes. Most studio comedies end on the biggest laugh or the warmest feeling, the moment of maximum emotional satisfaction that sends the audience out of the cinema having received exactly what they came for. Big Momma's House 2 does not do this. Its final moments are quiet. They are still. There is no punchline, no comedic callback to an earlier joke, no final appearance of Big Momma to bookend the film with the character that gave it its title. There is a hospital room. There is a man and a woman and a newborn. There is silence. And in that silence, the film is making an argument that it has been building toward from its opening frame, that the most important moments in a life are not the operational ones. They are not the cases solved or the criminals caught or the suits worn convincingly enough to fool an entire household for weeks. They are the moments that happen in the silence between performances, in the spaces where the disguises are off and the professional identities are set aside, and the only thing left is the actual human being that all of those performances have been protecting. Malcolm Turner's life has been a series of performances in the service of avoiding that silence. The film ends in the silence he has been running from, and the ending asks us to believe, without promising, without guaranteeing, without the false certainty of a genre resolution that ties everything up, that he might finally be ready to stay there. What Big Momma's House 2 understands about love that most studio comedies do not is that love is not a feeling that resolves things. It is a practice that continues things. Malcolm and Sheila do not leave that hospital room with their problems solved. They leave it with their problems clearly named for the first time, named by Malcolm's confession, named by Sheila's choice to stay, named by the weeks of absence and the midnight phone calls and the slow closing of doors that were once open. What they have at the end of this film is not a resolution. It is an honest starting point. They know what they are working with now. They know what Malcolm is capable of doing when the work calls, and he does not want to admit it. They know what Sheila is capable of enduring and where that endurance has its limits. They know what the job costs and what the marriage costs and what it looks like when those two costs are being borne unequally by the person who did not choose the job. That knowledge is not comfortable. It is not the warm resolution that a studio comedy promises, but it is real. And a marriage built on a real understanding of who both people actually are is more durable than a marriage built on the performance of who both people wish they were. The film knows this. It ends on honesty rather than happiness. In a genre that almost always chooses happiness, that choice is the most radical thing Big Momma's House 2 ever does. The final word on Big Momma's House 2 belongs to what the film does with its own limitations. It is too short to fully explore every psychological and thematic thread it opens. It is too committed to its comedy format to give its dramatic material the sustained attention it occasionally deserves. It has a villain who needed to be twice as developed as he is, a thriller narrative that needed to be twice as tense, and a resolution that resolves some things so quickly that the speed itself becomes a kind of dishonesty. These are the film's genuine limitations, and they are the limitations of a studio product made within the constraints of a genre and a budget and an audience expectation that did not fully accommodate the ambitions of the people making it. But within those limitations, something happened that was not required to happen and was not guaranteed to happen and does not happen often enough in films of this kind. A cast of performers committed fully to material that did not require their full commitment. A director made tonal choices that served the story rather than the genre. A screenplay reached, imperfectly, towards something true. And the result is a film that, 20 years after its release, still has something to say to the people who watch it with the attention it deserved and never quite received. That is more than most films manage. That is, in the context of what this film was up against, a form of triumph. Put it on. Watch it without the critical consensus in your head. Let it be what it actually is rather than what you were told it was. You might be surprised by what you find, and the things that surprise you are usually the things worth remembering.